Copyright Stanford University, all rights reserved.
Inherited genetic disorders in the era of genomic medicine. And the overview of the talk is that we'll be discussing inherited genetic diseases, and especially the move from single gene analysis to genomes. I'll talk to you about some databases and very useful resources. You can use these every day, even if you don't have a lot of knowledge of genomic medicine. And I'll also talk about structural variations in the genome and how those affect inherited genetic conditions. And then we'll go into the identifications of genes associated with disease. And I'll go into examples of how these new methods can be utilized to identify disease genes in methods where we don't have, in diseases where we don't have the genes identified. And I will use two landmark papers, one that identified the gene for Kabuki syndrome by whole exome sequencing, and the other one that used whole genome analysis to identify the, one of the genes in Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. So first, like I said, back to basics. You do need to know the patterns of inheritance whenever you deal with inherited genetic diseases. So very briefly, just to refresh your memory, with autosomal dominant disease, males and females are affected in equal proportions. You have to have one mutation in order to get the disease. With autosomal recessive inheritance, the parents are typically unaffected carriers. And in rare autosomal recessive disorders, there can be consanguinity in the families. But with cystic fibrosis, for example, that is really uncommon. So with more common conditions that are autosomal recessive, consanguinity does typically not play a role. And such parents have a risk of 1 in 4 of having an affected child, and you have to have 2 mutations to have the disease. With X-linked recessive inheritance, shown here, there's no male-to-male transmission. The females have 2 X's, and they are typically unaffected carriers, and the males are affected. With X-linked dominant disease, again, no male-to-male transmission, but males and females are both affected, and you get a pedigree looking like that. Now, complex pedigree of mitochondrial disease, where you can see that the transmission occurs entirely through the maternal line, but males and females can be affected. And in this pedigree, there's actually the interesting phenomenon of skipping of a generation. So that's a phenomenon called reduced penetrance. So these patterns of inheritance are great when you're thinking about rare genetic disorders. They usually work really well in that context. But, of course, our patients do not read textbooks, and there are exceptions. So if you think about a common recessive trait, then in a pedigree, it can actually really look like a dominant disorder. And a really great example of that is blood group O. Multiple different people can have brought blood group O into a family, and then when you look at the actual pedigree, it can look like it's autosomal dominant. We already talked a little bit about